You had opportunities earlier in your career to meet with influential founders like Steve Jobs. Also, you know the co-founders of Tesla, JB Straubel, in early 2000s. Can you discuss why you choose not to work with Steve Jobs or Tesla's first?
Well, that's very funny stories. You're you're turning up some of the secrets of Steve Blank's the worst choices in life. Um, so when Steve Jobs started next, I met him at Apple when I was trying to sell him some stuff, and is a longer story. I've met some of the engineers when they were designing the Mac, and they actually designed one of the chips I was manager of in one of my chip companies. But Steve used to take people out for interviews and long walks. And back then, Next was in a town called Redwood City near the bay, and we went for a walk. And about I don't know, 5 minutes into the walk, we both decided simultaneously that this would be a bad idea for me working for him. I decided that as a marketeer, that wouldn't be my job. My job would be to do whatever marketing Steve Jobs wanted to do, and Steve Jobs realized immediately that I wouldn't be doing what he wanted to do, and there could only be one marketeer in the company. So he said, "What do you say we turn around and walk back?" And when I came back, my friend who was the VP of engineering at the time, John Rubenstein, said, "That's the shortest interview I've ever seen Steve have." And I said, "Well, for good reason." So the answer was I didn't turn down working for Steve Jobs. He quickly decided, probably a nanosecond before I did, that this would be a bad idea. The Tesla story is actually more fun. After my 8th startup, I met somebody who was running, I think it was Nissan's automotive research center in Silicon Valley, Scott Andrews, who had this idea about electric cars way before most people had actually been thinking about it. And he had sketched out on a napkin for me the difference between a hybrid or a pure electric vehicle. And pretty quickly, we decided that maybe we should do a car startup as my 9th startup. And so we were sitting in an office I had down the street from my house, and we found a recent graduate of Stanford, a kid who was driving a Porsche, but attached to the Porsche was a battery pack and a trailer. And so he had electrified his Porsche 944 driving around Palo Alto, and the kid's name was JB Straubel. And JB, of course, went on to be the CTO and co-founder of Tesla. And JB and I and Scott must have worked, I don't know, 3-4 months on this electric vehicle startup until I realized a couple of things. One was it was probably, and again, this was my brilliant observation, it might take 10 years and $50 million to do this company. I was off by about 2 decades and about 100x in the amount of capital we would need. Well, most importantly for me, I realized that I no longer had the passion and interest to commit to a startup at the level that was necessary. In the United States, there's something called a red-eye flight, which means you would fly at nighttime, overnight, from one coast of the United States, from California to New York and vice versa, to make a meeting in the morning. And I would do that often when I was a passionate entrepreneur. I'd call somebody in the afternoon and from California, set up an 8 a.m. meeting, take a red eye, and literally come back to California that same day because it was an important meeting. I realized after my 8th startup, I had become maybe too successful and too old to want to do that. And I was going to be competing with other entrepreneurs who would do that. And if you couldn't do that, if you couldn't stay in the game, it was time to retire and go home. And I told that to JB and Scott, and they were disappointed. Though JB went on to find a much more competent CEO and certainly a much more successful career than if he would have hung out with me. But I think the lesson there for me, which I've now used as a test, is would you do the same things that you would have done, when you were like eager and passionate? And if the answer is no, you're going to be competing with the people who will. And you ought to decide whether you still want to be in the game or not. So that's a very long story of 2 questions no one has ever asked me. So far you're batting 100 of asking questions no one's ever done.